Well, I'll start this off with Carl and Carl and all the local county extension agents found out that I went to school at New Mexico State, so they figured if I went to school to learn how to run cattle down south, I could talk about drought, so.
Yeah.
So here we go. So we'll talk a little bit about spring grazing potential after a dry fall. Now, if you're in the northeast corner of the state, we got lucky. But there about August and September and early October, it was looking like it was gonna get dry and stay dry. But things kind of changed a little bit, but that's not the same case for the rest of the state. I think the rest of the state's starting to get a little parched, so. So the biggest thing that I'd like to start with would be stocking rate. And I'll dive into it a little bit, but if you read some of the drovers magazines or anything that comes out of the West, stocking rate is really kind of the most important decision that ranchers have to make, because it affects just about everything. It affects how productive your livestock are going to be, how healthy the rangeland is going to become, stay, hope to be. So we did some work down in Arizona, and it's all across the West, even in Dakotas. Well, the Dakotas are still part of the West to me, but anytime that you have increased stocking pressure or longer grazing than normal or what have you, those cattle start to graze further away from water. They graze longer periods of the day. One, affecting how much weight they're saving, putting on, especially in the middle of the summer, and then how long your plants are sitting there getting defoliated every year, every single day when it's hot and dry, or even when it's good and raining. So it's an important thing, dry or wet. And setting a stocking rate is pretty wild, different places, but it really comes down to some key management decisions. When I was down at New Mexico State, I did my research over in central Arizona, north of Phoenix, about 100 miles. And there they got monsoon system. And they said, if we don't have rain by the 4th of July, we have to sell. And if we haven't had this much rain by the 15th of August, we have to sell. And so they had key management dates set up. And the same way New Mexico was. Now, I'll ask this question. When you guys are setting how many cattle to keep for the year, or when you're going to turn out to pasture, kind of what is your, on the 1st of June or whenever, like kind of what's your date thinking? Like, okay, this is how many cattle can go out. Does there anybody have like, I know I can put 100 head of cows on this section starting June 1st because of this. Anybody have like a specific date or anything in mind?
Usually it's June 1st, but usually it's when the snow melt and how much hay I got left over.
Okay. Anybody else?
Okay.
Rain? And it rained by a certain date, or?
I think most people have their calendar set in stone, you know, if they're running stalkers or something, or yearly Sunday ways. But I think most people, everyone's here, keep their calendar intact.
Yeah. So our at home where I grew up in South Dakota, and it's about, well, pretty much straight south of here, 5.5 hours or so. It was, I know what barring how much hay you have, I know what I can keep going into the winter because of how much hay we got. And then 2, if we haven't had much for moisture by the 15th of May, we're dumping cows. And the olds, the opens and honories, they go to town really quick. So, and that's a lot of people around there because it just, when it gets dry, it's dry. So, but the goal, I think with most people's stocking rates is to leave kind of a minimum amount of residue whenever the period is. So when I down in that ranch in Arizona, based off 350 head of Corriente cows, which didn't eat, I mean, they just looked at grass and they gained weight, but
They didn't gain weight.
they didn't gain weight, they lived. But he figured that he'd have, once, 1st of July hit and the monsoon started, or at the end of the monsoon, that he's gonna have enough to carry that many cattle all the way to the monsoon next year. So, and that was his goal. Now, we're in a much different setting here than central Arizona. Grass doesn't grow real well here in September like it does down there. But around here, based off of dry matter, we have about 900 to 1,800 pounds an acre. And kind of the rule of thumb is to take half, leave half mindset. And that's about 40 to 50% utilization, which it's not, if you got a plant that's 2 foot tall, it's not taking 1 foot. You better get about 2/3 of that plant taken for about 40% utilization, just because most of the weight's down the bottom compared to up at the top. And in this area, 16 to 25 inches of rain. They claim, and I think this is more, I'd say South Dakota, Nebraska, but about 1/3 of it in the springtime. I think there's a little bit more moisture in springtime rain here compared to maybe farther south, but. So going back to the stocking rate, we want to just, going into the season, June 1st, it's going, okay, how much is out here? We got to predict kind of our standing crop, and that's going to help drive what we're going to have for a stocking rate and decisions during grazing. I mean, we could have great grass by the 1st of July and the well dries up, and then we got a long time until we start wanting to feed hay. But having a good estimate of standing crop on the front end helps us be a little bit more flexible in the back end. But when we get a little dry in the spring, what happens? Grass turns hard, it doesn't grow very tall. So we get in a little bit tougher situation. Are we going to make it to September? Do we have corn stocks we can get cattle on in October, November? Is there things that we can do? Or do we have to get cattle off? And saddest time I've seen when I was growing up was when there was a lot of good looking cattle, not just the olds and the ornery ones that were going to town, but when the good looking heifers and 4 and 5 year olds had to hit the truck too. So that drought starts to make you pretty vulnerable fairly quickly. So bringing her back to precip, in this part of the country, precip kind of is the bigger driver of a lot of things that's going on as far as forage production. Without moisture, there is no grass. You got a dry winter, and I'm thinking to 2012, like in South Dakota, we had no snow, 50 degrees all winter, and then we had no rain, and we had no grass when we went into that spring grazing system. But if you look at a map, and I'll go back to this other one, as you go west to east, there's about a threefold increase in forage production with the increasing moisture gradient west to east. And then precip wise, and then with that west to east gradient, there's also about a 4-fold increase in grass production, forage production. Now in North Dakota, it's a little North Dakota, South Dakota, and the northern part of Nebraska, this mixed grass prairie here in the blue, they claim that temperature isn't the biggest driver. I mean, we can get grass greened up a little earlier, but warmer temperatures right away isn't going to make a whole lot more forage production compared to the precip amount. Now, that's a little different when you get to the far east in the tall grass prairie, Red River Valley, Minnesota, Iowa. That is a temperature thing because that area is a lot more of a warm grass mix, and so those grasses don't start to green up till late June, early July, and August. Whereas ours here, June 1st, they're rocking and rolling. We got brome and bluegrass that's going to seed by 15th of June. So now the other thing that's probably the most important is the timing of moisture. So it's great when somebody asks and you go, yeah, I got 25 inches of rain this year, 25 inches of precip. Now, when you're looking at that, it's average for the area, sounds pretty good. But one question, like when our cornfields dry out, what's really using that rainfall? Once we get maturity or that first killing frost, what's using that rain that's coming down? Not too much. So once that at growing forages, that rain in the fall isn't very useful. Now, on the backside, it does do a real good job of getting into the ground because here again, nothing's using. So we don't have warm temperatures to where it's evaporating off too fast. We've got good soils that are still warm, that are gonna soak that stuff up like a sponge, because August has been dry, hopefully. And then, one thing we gotta look at is how much infiltrates. Well, on good management, most of it's gonna go in. Now you get those hard rains where it's just gonna run off no matter what. But after that first killing frost, we can really lead to a heck of a groundwater recharge. So we get that, groundwater 3 foot, 6 foot, that subsoil moisture really picks up real fast with that good moisture. And that's something when we were looking at this on the 15th of August going, what's going to happen here? We're starting to get pretty dry pretty quick. Because Carrington didn't get, we're an 1.75 inches under average for September. And I mean, we fed cattle in a canoe all summer till August and September rolled around. So it was kind of nice for the drying, but then you're going, hey, slow down. Maybe a little shot of rain might be helpful. Another thing that's really beneficial about those late fall or those fall time rainfalls is wetter soils slow down soil cooling. So we can have more active root systems going on, especially in our prairie grasses, when that soil is wet going into the fall. We can have cooler night temperatures, but wetter soils keep the soil temperature a little higher. So we have a little longer photosynthesis going on for our plants. They get to pull in a little bit more carbohydrate reserves for springtime energy. It also lets things kind of break down a little bit more into the fall, get some of that old residue out of the way. We do produce a lot of fiber in our grasslands, so trying to get some of that litter broken down before the winter comes and everything stops is kind of beneficial too. Helps fertilizer or fertility, and then again, warm up in the spring, less duff layer, less litter layer on the surface really helps warm things up a little quicker. That, and then lastly, limited rainfall going into the winter is pretty bad when it comes to getting a frost line. No snow, we get a deep frost line. Dry soils going into the winter, we get some really gnarly stuff. In 2017, right when I started at New Mexico State for my PhD, I remember talking to some friends in Watertown, South Dakota. Water lines were at 7 feet and they were breaking because there was no snow. It was really dry, and that frost and that cold temperature in December hit them, cracked the ground, got all the way down and broke water lines that deep. So having a little moisture is a good thing. As far as grass growth is concerned, though, our spring moisture is kind of our jump start. The greatest predictor of forage production is spring moisture, and I'll show you. I'll try to decipher some eggheads thinking here in a minute, but some late spring, early summer moisture is key, especially around here where that's the peak grass growth time. And oh boy, that didn't come out very well. So I have two graphs, and they're both out of North Dakota. First one, this is Streeter at the Central Grasslands Research Extension Center, out of the paper. And they put together the precip, which is in the solid black, the temperature, which is in the dashed black, and then the forage growth curve, which is in this almost unseeable color right here. And so we get in Streeter on average, our pretty much peak precipitation is right when peak forage production is going on. I got a line in there. So about that early part of June is right when peak grass is going on. And that's also for Streeter about the time when they get the most moisture. And then they keep it up just a little bit for that grass to keep going. And a second graph here, and this one's out of Dickinson, out of the research center out there, kind of the same thing, to where this is a little later in June, but still east to west gradient, they're not that close together. but yet the peak green up time is about the same time. And that's when the moisture does fall.
I don't know if they're dominated by cool season grasses.
What's that?
Are they dominated by cool season grasses?
They have a little bit more of like a short grass step, but most of them are still that cool season.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, as you get farther south, it's like Cottonwood, South Dakota, which is near Wall. It's about straight south Hettinger-ish versus Highmore. It was in the same paper as this one. The Highmore site straight south, pretty close to south of Streeter. And then the Wall site, completely different curve. I mean, it's about June for the Highmore site, so very similar to Dickinson, but then it pushed further into July for that Cottonwood site because warmer temperatures, drier conditions, a lot more warm season grasses out there. And they're quite a bit shorter too, so. Now, this is I'm gonna make sense of the soup sandwich here. So this graph I wanted to show, and this is out of actually out of Streeter. But the ARS put this out, the ones out of Mandan. And so this graph right here shows the precip from January to June. So snowfall, whatever we get in that time frame at Streeter. And so I want to focus mainly in these two blue lines here. And so the way this is set up is we're looking at kind of when we get enough moisture, do we get more grass growth out of it? And this is kind of the point. So about 110% of normal is the point where we don't really get much more grass out of it. Does that make sense? Okay, but if you're looking at it, so from January to June, if we get somewhere between 60 and 80% of the normal moisture, we're going to get about 60 to 80% of the normal grass growth. That's what that means. And so, okay, now my next one, and this is where I want to emphasize the spring moisture. So January to June, this is May to June. Same setup here to where this is 100% grass growth. So if you're looking at this, so 80% of your moisture in May to June timeframe leads to nearly 100%, about 105% of your grass production. Compared to 40% at about 55%. So getting that 20% extra moisture in that short little time, 60 day time span leads to almost a 40% increase in grass growth. Is that clear as mud? Did I do okay? Any questions on this one? So that's the big thing on timing of moisture. We can get through a dry winter. We can get some rain in May and June and we're still okay. Now, I'm not going to say we're going to be great. We're going to be okay. So, as I mentioned earlier, the northeast corner of the state isn't sitting too bad on moisture, but that's not the same for the rest of the state. So we've got 1/3 of North Dakota is currently not in a drought state, but 2/3 of it is. And we don't have to go very far from Carrington or too far west, too far south to get into it. And so that yellow, that D0, that abnormally dry, shouldn't take too long to encroach up into this into this area right here. So going into spring, so Carrington got some needed moisture. In feedlot sense, I really didn't want it because then I got a bunch of wet weaned calves. But we did get some moisture there after the ground started to freeze. And so I think we recharged into a good state going into the spring. But like I said, that's not for everybody. Some drier fall conditions, they're gonna cause reduced grass growth no matter what. And that's from the standpoint of, we had a nice fall, we probably had cattle out on pastures or croplands, but we probably had cattle out a little longer than maybe normal. And one thing when we're grazing some of that grass, a little short because we're keeping them out there just a little bit longer. They start to nip off some of the green buds that those plants are gonna use for next year, for this spring coming up. So we take some of those growth points off, which could back up spring green up and production. Another thing, some of those forages, because it got a little parched a little early. Once we didn't get real hot, we just kind of dried up. But those forages may have matured a little earlier, they senesced a little earlier, and they went out. So again, we took off material that's gonna catch some of hopefully some of the snow. And with that grazing that we may or may not have done, those deeper roots that they have, most plants, if it's 2 foot tall, it's probably gonna have 2 to 3 foot deep roots. So if we start clipping those plants off through grazing, the plant goes, I don't need that much root material down below. I'm gonna slough some of it off. And so in a drier condition where that, top foot or so starts to dry out, now I don't have any moisture in the spring for that grass to take off. So some things to be wary of. So you'll, even with normal precip, going back to it, if you were a little dry in the fall, plan on a little bit of a reduction in your forage production going into the spring. Could be 10 to 30%, and that's off of NDSU extension estimates. Now, if dry conditions increase, we can go into the spring and go, hey, I can plant barley early, but I also didn't get any rain. So that spring and early summer drought's really gonna hit production, and especially even if you had normal moisture going into the fall, you're gonna be setting yourself back pretty fast. And so you're gonna have some limited production due to any spring dryness if we do see it. And that's one thing, going back to your dates, if it's June 1st that you normally turn out, it's like, I just can't quite do it yet. Hopefully you have the options to where you can be flexible.
So if you had like a good hay production this year, you had the extra hay and not have you got that dry fall, you can feed them weeks later.
Good. That could be one option. Another one might be like, hey, I know I got some broken mouth cows that I just need to get rid of. Or I got some bad toes. Like, let's sell some pairs, calved them out, did all the hard work. Let's give it to somebody else to have fun with the rest of the year.
Is it better to feed that hay early or let them out normal time and keep that hay for later?
Grass standpoint.
So once you get to a grass, there is an extension publication on it, but once you get to about the 3-leaf stage on grass, so not bluegrass because it only has 2 leaves, but you get to brown grass with 3 leaves, and they're about 3.5 inches or so tall, you're probably not going to outcompete the production. So if you've got to the point of 3.5 leaves and 3 or 4 inches tall, you could get cattle out there and you're not going to see this big hit. Putting them out early is going to hurt. So if you put them out too early, let's say we have a dry spring, grass doesn't green up real quick, it'd be better to feed them until you get to that point, versus you could really limit your production getting them out there too early.
So is your goal to keep that grass in the most vegetative stage in case it does rain in the future? Put them on there, pull them off?
So there's a few ways to look at it.
Go to seed instantly done for the year.
So if we turn out on brome grass, or if you go a little farther west and you get into some of the bunch grasses, once that gets nipped off, it's going to be your bromes will come back a little bit. But if you can get them out there fairly early, you can push back that senescence date. You can push back that maturity a little bit. So they're going to try to rehead out. But if you wait too long, and this is where waiting too long on grazing, you limit production too, because you get that plants to get up, they put a head on, and they go, I've done what I need to do for the year. See you next year. But if you get out and take it, knock it back a little bit, maybe like an intensive type grazing system, if you could do that, or set up a pasture to where I'm going to put a few more cows in here, let them work it down a little bit. That could be something where you can come back in the fall and hit it again. So just depending on whatever your management strategy is. So,
Well, it's tough, cause in the spring you need about 2,000 cows and dip everything. And
Yeah.
In October you need 50.
right. And so if you've
Hard
got,
to manage your herd on the grass, you need so many cows in the nip that cool season, to get it growing again.
and so, yeah, do you dedicate one place to be like, I'm gonna dump? And we've done that. We've at home on the family place, we took a couple parcels and then we created it. They're spring only, so we calve out. And we put the pairs out there, so it's nice and dry for them. And but we do is in the heat of the summer when those tall season, warm season grasses are growing, we go and hit it pretty hard. So that way, the cool season grasses kind of green up in the fall, and then they take off right away in the spring. And so then we've got good production when we do calve out. And we also have some places that we nuke it pretty hard in the spring, early, once we get done calving. We nuke some areas, get a lot of good summer grass, tall grasses growing and then we're out there in the fall. So that way there's plenty of fiber to hit in the fall time. So yeah, it's tough, especially if you're not set up to do it too. If you've got quarter section pastures versus more an intense, 10 acres, 40 acres, what have you, depending on whatever your management strategy is. To finish up, there's a few prediction tools out there. This one's put out, there's about all the states and the plains are together on this grass cast. And I can get this to any of your local extension agents if you'd like to, but you can Google grass cast. And what it is it looks at your soil moisture and your moisture that you got for the year compared to the last about 30. And so if we're up here looking, here's Foster County, Ramsey, we're in this, probably 5 to some cases, maybe 30% extra moisture compared to the long-term average. So you could predict that there's going to be good soil moisture, probably some good potential grass growth right away in the spring. Now, that's not the case for other parts of the western part of the state, and then other parts of the plains as well. And this, I zoomed into these two states, but it does, you can do all the plains and you can do the Southwest, which you can kind of look at the difference between them. Now, New Mexico State's in one of the worst dry periods ever, and the whole part of southern New Mexico is like less than, or this negative 30% or more. So it's a useful tool to use. Cross this one off the list. I don't know how to do that. Or just remind tomorrow. NOAA also puts out seasonal outlooks for precip. And then I picked this one out April to June. It doesn't show up very good, but right here, we're looking, call it normal. But you don't have to get very far outside of North Dakota, and they're predicting a little bit below average precip. So you never know how fast that marker can skew. So just be vigilant. So with that, any questions?